In the summer of the year 2000, detectives walked onto a rural Kansas farm. They were there to arrest a man for what they, basically assumed was a localized case of theft and assault.
Right, they thought it was just a standard domestic-level crime.
Exactly. But instead, when they cracked open the storage units on that property, they uncovered something entirely different. They found a 1970s analog con man who had secretly built one of the very first and deadliest digital hunting grounds on the consumer internet.
It was a massive paradigm shift for law enforcement.
Truly. So welcome to another Control Studies Deep Dive. And for those of you joining us for the first time, our mission here is strict and it's highly analytical.
Yeah, we do not traffic in sensationalism at all.
No, we don't. We aren't here to recount horror stories or, build up the mythology of monsters. We look at human predators as operational systems.
We approach these cases as organizational audits, really. An organization of one, sure, but an organization nonetheless.
Right, because a predator relies on logistics, protocols, risk assessments, and basic assumptions about their environment.
And our objective is to isolate the specific methodological flaws that cause those systems to collapse. We want to analyze what a highly disciplined, corrected approach would have actually looked like.
Exactly. And the system we are auditing today belongs to a man named John Edward Robinson. Born in the early 1940s, he presented to the outside world as the ultimate Midwestern pillar of the community.
He really did. He was a scoutmaster, a church leader, a devoted family man in the Kansas City area.
But beneath that perfectly manicured, bureaucratic exterior, he was running a decades-long fraud ring. And more importantly for our structural analysis, he is widely recognized as the first serial killer to systematically weaponize the anonymity of cyberspace.
The transition from the analog world of typewriters to the digital world of dial-up modems is, well, it's the pivot point of this entire case.
Yeah, because he didn't start his operations online. He spent decades testing his methodology in the physical world.
Right. So our goal today is to map that operational system from its foundation in white-collar forgery, trace its escalation into cyberspace, and pinpoint the exact structural failures that brought his double life crashing down.
So, to understand the digital predator, we really have to pull apart the analog fraudster. If you look at the source materials we've gathered for you today, Robinson's blueprint begins in Cicero, Illinois.
He was born there at the tail end of 1943.
And the environmental baseline here is crucial for understanding his need for control later in life. His father was an alcoholic machinist, which led to a highly unpredictable household.
Right, a lot of volatility. And on the other side, his mother was an incredibly strict disciplinarian.
So you have this constant friction between chaos and rigid, unyielding rules.
Exactly. But the output of that environment wasn't, immediate juvenile delinquency. His early life was actually defined by extreme, almost aggressive outward promise.
Yeah, he was an overachiever on paper.
Very much so. By the age of 13, he reaches the rank of Eagle Scout.
Which takes a lot of discipline.
It does. Then, in 1957, something highly unusual happens that sets a profound psychological precedent. He travels to London with a chorister and scout group.
Okay, right.
He performs at the London Palladium in front of Queen Elizabeth II, and backstage he is famously kissed by Judy Garland.
I have to stop you there because I found myself stuck on that detail while reviewing our notes. It sounded like a fabricated memory, like something a narcissist would just make up.
I know, it sounds entirely fictional, but it actually happened. It is fully documented.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
clinically, it establishes a very specific taste for high-level public validation. At a formative age, he learns the sheer intoxicating power of being perceived as exceptional.
Right, he is rewarded on an international stage for performing a role perfectly.
Exactly. That feeling of public legitimacy becomes the drug he chases, and eventually he learns to manufacture it for the rest of his life.
But maintaining actual legitimate excellence requires foundational work, and that is where the system begins to fracture, right?
Yeah, the real effort proves to be too much. He enrolls at Quigley Preparatory Seminary in Chicago, a school for young men considering the priesthood, but he is disruptive and drops out after a year.
And then he pivots to Morton Junior College to train as a medical radiographer, an X-ray technician.
Right. But he drops out of that program after roughly 2 years, failing to actually secure a degree.
And this is the critical juncture. Instead of pivoting to a new career or starting from the bottom somewhere else, he makes a structural decision that defines his entire methodology. He simply alters reality on paper.
Yes, he begins forging diplomas. In the mid-1960s, he uses a fabricated Morton College diploma to secure employment as an X-ray technician at multiple hospitals in the Kansas City area.
I mean, the audacity of this early fraud cannot be overstated. We are talking about operating complex medical imaging equipment without formal qualifications.
It's terrifying, honestly.
Let's pause and really think about the mechanics of that.
Mm.
He is walking into a hospital, handing them a piece of heavy cardstock with a fake seal, and they are handing him control of radiation equipment.
That was the reality of 1960s HR departments. The paper carried the authority.
But you can't fake technical skills indefinitely. Eventually, a doctor is going to point at an X-ray machine and say, run this diagnostic, and he is just pressing buttons and hoping the contrast looks right.
Right, and he was inevitably fired from these positions when his utter lack of technical competence became dangerous and obvious.
But the critical takeaway for our operational audit is how Robinson processed that failure. A normal person would conclude that forging credentials is a failed strategy. You got caught.
But Robinson concluded that the forgery was highly successful because it got him the job, the salary, and the status. The failure, in his mind, was merely a lack of technical follow-through.
Wow, so he learned that a piece of paper carrying the aesthetics of authority could effortlessly override human suspicion.
Precisely. And while he is refining this professional deception, he is constructing an impregnable personal cover. In 1964, he marries Nancy Jo Lynch.
Right, and they have 4 children over the next 7 years.
To the neighbors, they are a rock-solid traditional household. But behind closed doors, he is perpetually absent, running multiple affairs and covert operations.
Yet this marriage survives for 40 years. It only dissolves when she files for divorce in 2005, long after his final arrest.
The level of compartmentalization he achieved from his early 20s it's staggering.
Compartmentalization really is the load-bearing pillar of his psychology. He engineered massive, impenetrable firewalls between his domestic life, his public civic life, and his private criminal enterprises.
And moving from the late 60s into the 80s, this architecture supports a relentless series of financial crimes. For example, in 1969, he embezzles $33,000 from a radiologist, Dr. Wallace Graham.
And he receives 3 years of probation for that.
Right. Then, in 1970, while working for Mobil Oil Corporation, he steals 6,200 postage stamps.
Okay, I have to interject here, because the stamp theft is such a bizarrely specific administrative crime. It's not robbing a safe, it's quietly siphoning office supplies on an industrial scale.
It demonstrates pure logistical opportunism.
Like, how do you even move 6,000 stamps?
He identified a fungible resource that could be easily monetized or utilized for his own mailings, and he systematically extracted it.
That's wild. So what happened with the stamps?
He managed to reduce the charge to a misdemeanor by paying restitution, but then he subsequently violates his probation, relocates to Chicago, secures a position selling insurance, embezzles $5,500 there, and is extradited back to Kansas.
So he's bouncing around, but the method is the same.
Always. By the late 1970s, he maneuvers his way into a role as an employee relations manager at Guy's Foods. There, he utilizes ghost employees and fabricated vouchers to siphon over $41,000.
When you look at this pattern, he is essentially executing an analog version of social engineering. He isn't hacking a mainframe. He is manipulating the people who control the access.
Exactly. He's hacking human trust.
But I keep bumping up against a major logical hurdle here. Why didn't his wife, his neighbors, or his church community notice the massive discrepancies? He is bringing in tens of thousands of dollars in embezzled funds, getting fired, getting arrested, and yet maintaining this veneer of the perfect scoutmaster.
You have to view this through the technological lens of the 1970s. There was no internet.
Right, no Google.
Exactly. There were no centralized, publicly accessible digital databases. Reputation was strictly localized and heavily reliant on physical presentation.
So if you burned a bridge or faced charges in Chicago?
You could simply drive across state lines to Kansas City, present a crisp, impeccably typewritten resume on high-quality paper, and completely reset your identity.
Wow.
Robinson recognized that institutions and communities defer to the presentation of authority. If you look the part and carry the right paperwork, people do not dig deeper.
And the absolute zenith of this social engineering and the detail that perfectly encapsulates his reliance on manufactured reality is the charity luncheon.
Oh, the Man of the Year award.
Yes. In the late 70s, he is already a Sunday school teacher and a scoutmaster, but his ego demands formal public coronation.
So he joins the board of a local charity for individuals with disabilities.
And in 1977, he actually sits down at a typewriter and forges letters of commendation from the charity's executive director and, more shockingly, from the mayor of Kansas City.
Praising his own fictitious volunteer efforts.
But he didn't just forge the letters. He utilized those fabricated endorsements to engineer his own selection as the organization's Man of the Year.
And he organized and hosted a public awards luncheon in his own honor.
I mean, the narcissism is blinding, but operationally, it proves his thesis.
It does.
He understood that a piece of letterhead bearing the correct typography and an authoritative signature literally alters reality for the people reading it.
He manufactured his own legitimacy out of thin air, and an entire room of civic leaders clapped for him.
Those early decades were his beta testing phase.
Yeah.
He mastered the art of existing seamlessly in two parallel worlds.
However, paper crimes inherently hit a profitability ceiling. You can only embezzle from an employer for so long before the accounting department conducts an audit.
Right, the numbers have to balance eventually.
Exactly. The physical trail of stolen funds always eventually triggers an investigation.
And this brings us to the most critical pivot in his methodology. When the financial fraud hit that ceiling, he didn't abandon the system.
No, she adapted it.
He applied the exact same fraudulent framework, the exact same bureaucratic logic to human beings.
The transition from embezzlement to disappearances is structurally seamless. Moving into the 1980s, Robinson incorporates a series of shell companies with highly legitimate-sounding names, primarily Equiplus and Equi2.
Right, and on paper, these are management consulting and investment firms. Let's break down how a shell company actually functioned as a shield in the 1980s.
It was entirely different from today.
Yeah, today, you look up a company online, check its LinkedIn presence, its Google Street View. Back then, if he rents a tiny office space, sets up a dedicated phone line, and prints glossy business cards.
Equi2 is suddenly a real corporate entity.
Exactly. And it's through Equi2 that the commodity he is acquiring violently shifts. In 1984, he hires a 19-year-old woman named Paula Godfrey as a sales representative.
He offers her the standard corporate package: training, business travel, a salary.
And shortly after, she vanishes without a trace.
The structural element that follows her disappearance is the direct evolution of his 1970s forgery tactics. A few days after she goes missing, her parents receive a typewritten letter.
And at the bottom is Paula's apparent signature.
Yes. The letter explicitly states she is safe, she has taken a new path in life, and she wishes to have no further contact with her family.
Think about the missing persons protocols in 1984. A family reports a 19-year-old adult missing. The local police department, already constrained by jurisdictional limits, looks at this typewritten letter.
And they see a document from an adult citizen requesting to be left alone.
Right. Without a body, without signs of a struggle, that piece of paper functions as an administrative stop-loss. They closed the case. No remains were ever recovered.
Robinson tested his paper shield against law enforcement, and it held flawlessly. He weaponized the inherent bureaucracy of police work.
That's a great way to put it. The letter provided the authorities with the exact documentation they needed to justify inaction.
Having validated this new protocol, he rapidly accelerates his operations. In early 1985, operating under the alias John Osborne, he identifies his next targets.
19-year-old Lisa Stassi and her 4-month-old infant daughter, Tiffany.
He targets them while they're living in a women's shelter in Kansas City.
The vulnerability is the point.
Absolutely. He approaches Lisa, claiming to represent the Kansas City Outreach Program, another fabricated entity. He offers her transitional housing, a job, relocation to Chicago, and financial assistance to complete her education.
Which sounds like a lifeline to someone in a shelter. So he moves Lisa and the baby into a motel to prepare for the supposed move. And this is where we see the most terrifying operational upgrade in his methodology.
Yes. While she is in the motel, he convinces her to sign several blank sheets of corporate letterhead.
We must analyze the cold administrative foresight of that action. Following Paula Godfrey's disappearance, Robinson likely realized that forging a victim's signature carried a slight long-term risk.
Right, because a suspicious family member or a handwriting expert might eventually notice anomalies.
Exactly. To neutralize that risk prospectively, he acquires the authentic signatures before the disappearance. By having Lisa Stassi sign blank paper, he guarantees that his future fabricated correspondence will bear an unimpeachable, biologically authentic signature.
It is a terrifying application of logistics to murder.
It really is. Shortly after providing those signatures, Lisa calls her relatives in a state of extreme distress. She claims that they are pressuring her, telling her she's an unfit mother, and trying to force her to sign relinquishment papers.
That is the last time anyone hears from Lisa Stassi. She and baby Tiffany vanish.
And what Robinson executes next redefines cynical opportunism. He contacts his own brother and sister-in-law, who had been actively trying to adopt a child for years.
He delivers baby Tiffany to them, claiming he has facilitated a legitimate private adoption.
He monetized the kidnapping of an infant.
He charged his own family $5,500 in legal fees to cover the adoption process. To legitimize the transaction, he provided them with a stack of forged adoption decrees, complete with fabricated signatures from fictitious lawyers and a non-existent judge.
It is the ultimate corporate acquisition strategy applied to human lives. He didn't just eliminate Lisa, he extracted the maximum financial value from the situation.
And it wasn't until the year 2000 that DNA testing finally confirmed that the teenager his brother had raised was, in fact, Tiffany Stassi.
Unbelievable. And perfectly adhering to his established protocol, shortly after Lisa vanished, her family received typewritten letters.
On that pre-signed letterhead.
Right. Claiming she had left voluntarily to start a new life and wanted no contact.
The pattern continues in 1987. 27-year-old Catherine Clampett responds to an advertisement for Equi2.
She leaves her child with her parents in Texas, relocates to Kansas City to work for Robinson, and vanishes after a scheduled meeting with him.
Her case remains officially unsolved in terms of physical remains, though Robinson later made admissions regarding her death in a plea agreement.
I want to push back on the traditional true crime narrative that surrounds cases like this.
Okay, how so?
Usually when we analyze an escalation from white-collar crime to disappearances, profilers talk about a psychological snap, a sudden break from reality, or an uncontrollable, violent urge.
Right, the escalation theory.
Exactly. But looking at the mechanics of Equi2 and the adoption fraud, there was no psychological break whatsoever. This was an incredibly steady, uninterrupted progression of his business model.
Your assessment is structurally sound. The underlying logic of his system never shifted. The forged diplomas of the 1960s simply evolved into the forged "I'm okay" letters of the 1980s.
The shell companies he used to embezzle from Guy's Foods were repurposed to lure vulnerable women.
He didn't suddenly become a chaotic killer. He became a highly organized, lethal administrator. The commodity changed, but the protocol remained perfectly intact.
Now, the physical expansion of his crimes might have continued unchecked, but the paper trails from his earlier financial frauds finally caught up with his localized reputation.
Yes, between 1987 and 1993, he is incarcerated in Kansas and Missouri for various fraud convictions and parole violations.
But if you look at the timeline, he uses prison not as a deterrent, but as an incubator. He secures a position in the prison library, and he immediately begins networking.
He starts grooming the prison librarian, Beverly Bonner. She would eventually leave her husband, go to work for Robinson following his release, and become one of his victims.
So prison temporarily halted his physical movement. But strategically, it was the worst possible outcome for public safety.
It provided him with years of uninterrupted time to conceptualize a broader, far more efficient hunting ground. The timing of his release is the most critical variable in this case.
Because when he walks out of prison in 1993, he enters a world that is undergoing a fundamental technological revolution.
He walks straight into the birth of the consumer internet.
Which triggers the next massive shift in our audit, weaponizing cyberspace. When Robinson is released in 93, he is 50 years old.
Right, he's not a kid growing up with computers.
Exactly. He could have been intimidated by new technology, but instead, he recognizes it as the ultimate evolution of his methodology.
He sets up a multi-computer array. He begins exploring dial-up bulletin board systems, early email protocols, and specifically BDSM chat rooms.
And he constructs an online alter ego operating under the handle Slavemaster.
To understand why this digital migration was so devastatingly effective, we have to contextualize the internet of the mid-1990s. It was not the hyper-surveilled, interconnected, algorithm-driven web we navigate today.
Not at all. It was the Wild West. You get an AOL disk in the mail, tie up your phone line, and just log into the void.
Exactly. For a con man who had spent 30 years relying on physical relocation and forged identities to evade localized scrutiny, cyberspace was the perfect, infinite shell company.
He could sit at a desk on his rural farm in Kansas and cast a predatory net across the entire globe, completely decoupled from his physical geography.
Picture yourself logging into an AOL chat room in 1994. There are no background checks, no verified profiles, no reverse image searches.
Right. You only exist as the text you type on the screen.
As Slavemaster, Robinson presents himself as a highly successful, wealthy businessman operating globally. He tells women in these chat rooms that he is seeking consensual slave partners, but he brilliantly intertwines this sexual dominance with massive financial incentives.
He isn't just pitching a lifestyle. He is pitching a career. He offers $60,000 salaries, luxury accommodations, and international business travel to Europe and Hawaii.
We must analyze his targeting parameters because they are ruthlessly precise. He did not engage randomly.
No, he sought out women who presented a specific matrix of vulnerabilities. He looks for financial distress, recent divorces, geographic isolation, and a lack of strong local support networks.
Let's look at the specific victims to understand this targeting. He targets a 21-year-old Polish immigrant named Izabela Lewica.
Why an immigrant? Because convincing her to relocate to Kansas severs whatever fragile local ties she has, and her primary family is an ocean away in Europe.
If she stops calling home, it might take months for her family to navigate international law enforcement to even report her missing.
He also targets a mother named Sheila Faith, who was living in California with her 15-year-old disabled daughter, Debbie.
And Robinson uses the promise of covering the daughter's extensive medical expenses and enrolling her in specialized schooling as the ultimate leverage.
He identified the exact logistical and emotional pressure point that would compel a mother to uproot her entire life and move across the country to Kansas.
It is a masterclass in exploiting specialized vulnerabilities.
And the decision to operate specifically within the BDSM subculture is the ultimate operational cover. Early internet BDSM communities were highly stigmatized.
Right, so they relied heavily on strict norms of secrecy, the use of pseudonyms, rigorous consent negotiations, and absolute discretion.
Participants almost never discussed these online activities with their mainstream friends or families.
Robinson weaponized those exact community standards. He framed total isolation from family and friends not as a glaring red flag, but as a standard negotiated feature of a submissive lifestyle contract.
He co-opted the language of consent to build a psychological prison before he ever built a physical one.
We have to talk about the mechanics of those contracts. In Izabela Lewica's case, investigators later found a 115-item slave contract that he required her to sign.
115 items.
Yes. This document granted him absolute unilateral control over her finances, her physical residence, her daily schedule, and her personal behavior.
It's like he discovered a zero-day exploit in human trust. By wrapping total financial and physical domination in the guise of a consensual lifestyle choice, he effectively convinced his victims to architect their own disappearance.
They signed away their autonomy on paper, and in his rigidly bureaucratic mind, that signature made his subsequent actions legally and morally justified.
Because it fits his paper logic perfectly.
Exactly. The contract served a dual purpose. It provided him with psychological permission, validating his absolute authority. Operationally, it provided a layer of pseudo-legal cover.
If a local police officer or a suspicious landlord ever stumbled upon the arrangement, Robinson could produce a signed, witnessed document proving that this was a radical but entirely consensual adult relationship.
And the infrastructure required to maintain this illusion was massive. We are talking about a rural Kansas farmhouse equipped with multiple phone lines and computers.
Where he is simultaneously managing his multiple identities, Slavemaster, Jim Turner, John Osborne, while also administrating fake corporate email domains to validate the employment offers.
But this raises a massive logistical question. How did he manage the digital footprint of so many distinct identities, especially after the women disappeared?
Right, he isn't just killing them. His system requires him to keep them alive digitally to prevent their families from panicking.
That administrative burden is the crux of his system, and it required an exhausting, almost unimaginable level of daily maintenance.
To truly grasp the sheer bureaucratic weight of this evasion strategy, we have to look at the system operating at peak capacity. We need to examine the timeline of his final known victim, Suzette Troughton.
Suzette Troughton's case brings all these methodologies together. The year is 2000. Suzette is a 27-year-old licensed practical nurse living in Michigan.
She encounters Robinson in these BDSM chat rooms in late 1999. He delivers the standard Slavemaster pitch.
An incredibly high-paying traveling caregiver job, ostensibly to care for his elderly father, wrapped inside a dominant submissive dynamic.
What stands out in Suzette's case is her initial caution. She didn't blindly accept the offer. She actually made 2 preparatory trips from Michigan to Kansas to meet him, inspect the living arrangements, and assess the situation before committing to the relocation.
This demonstrates that Robinson's grooming process was incredibly patient. His fabricated reality could withstand physical scrutiny.
Finally, in February of 2000, she agrees to the terms and relocates permanently to Kansas. He places her in a hotel, and she remains in constant daily contact with her mother back in Michigan via phone calls and internet messenger.
Then we hit the timeline of the collapse. On March 1st, 2000, Suzette calls her mother and tells her that she and Robinson are leaving for California that very day for a business trip.
After that phone call ends, Suzette is never heard from again.
Later that afternoon, Robinson is physically observed picking up Suzette's dogs from a local kennel.
He makes a brief trip to a commercial storage unit he rents, and then he returns to her hotel and checks out of her room alone. The hotel staff literally watch him loading her luggage into the back of his truck.
And this is precisely when the post-murder correspondence protocol activates. Within days of her vanishing, Suzette's family begins receiving letters and emails.
They are sent from her established email accounts or arrive as physical cards. But Robinson didn't rely on generic messages.
Prior to her murder, he had systematically extracted a comprehensive list of her extended family members' addresses and their specific birth dates.
He utilized that intelligence to send timely birthday cards and emails, meticulously pretending to be her. He even sent a physical birthday card to Suzette's grandmother.
And he went through the logistical hassle of having it routed and postmarked from California, perfectly corroborating the false narrative that she had relocated to the West Coast.
But he made a critical error in his impersonation. Her family noticed the tone was off.
More importantly, the emails completely lacked Suzette's usual, highly specific spelling errors.
The grammar was too formal, too bureaucratic.
He was running a full-time, posthumous public relations campaign. He was manually logging into her email accounts from his farm, drafting messages, and managing the narrative of her life.
And while he is sitting at his keyboard sending birthday cards from California, the brutal physical reality is that Suzette Troughton's body is sitting inside an 85-pound, sealed, industrial chemical drum on his rural property in Lynn County, Kansas.
He murdered her with blunt force trauma to the head, likely using a hammer, and then sealed her remains inside a specialized drum to contain the decomposition odors.
And it wasn't just one drum. He had engineered a distributed physical storage system.
He kept several drums on his sprawling Kansas farm, but he also rented a commercial storage unit across the state line in Raymore, Missouri, where he stored additional drums.
And the dark reality is that he isn't executing this elaborate impersonation just to buy time to escape. He's doing it to keep the financial extraction running.
Continuous financial redirection was the lifeblood of the entire operation.
If we look back at the victims from the mid-90s, he murdered Beverly Bonner, the prison librarian, but he rearranged for her monthly alimony checks to be routed to a post office box he controlled in Olathe, Kansas.
He successfully cashed her checks for years after her death.
He executed the exact same protocol with Sheila and Debbie Faith, redirecting their Social Security disability payments to that identical mailbox.
He was driving to town and collecting their government money every single month while their bodies were literally decomposing inside his rented storage unit.
This brings me to a major logical challenge regarding his risk assessment. He's going through this incredible, exhausting trouble to forge emails, fake spelling patterns, orchestrate out-of-state postmarks, and intercept federal mail.
Right.
Yet he is keeping the bodies in drums that he actively pays monthly rent on. He owns a rural farm. Why not just destroy the remains? Why not bury them deep in the woods where they would never, ever be found? Why physically hold on to the ultimate liability?
That question cuts to the absolute core of our structural analysis. Why retain the liability? Because in Robinson's rigidly narcissistic mind, they were not liabilities, they were assets.
He had acquired them.
Exactly. And this brings us directly to the methodological failures that caused his entire matrix to collapse.
The system collapsed. Everything comes crashing down in the spring of 2000. And the fascinating part is that it doesn't start with a brilliant cybercrimes detective uncovering his encrypted email routing.
No, it starts with a massive, localized behavioral failure on his part.
He arranges to meet 2 women from Texas, Vicky and Jana, for BDSM encounters in Kansas City.
But these encounters deviated entirely from his established protocol. He violently assaulted them, far exceeding any previously negotiated boundaries.
He explicitly ignored their safe words. He photographed them against their vehement refusal, and then, in a petty display of control, he stole hundreds of dollars worth of their specialized BDSM equipment.
And crucially, unlike the carefully selected isolated women she targeted for his long-term financial cons, Vicky and Gina survived the encounter.
They were not isolated. They had outside support networks, and they had a secure home base in Texas. They returned home, and they immediately filed police reports in Kansas for sexual battery and theft.
Those police reports handed local law enforcement the one tool they had lacked for over 30 years, probable cause.
Based on those complaints, on June 2, 2000, police arrest John Edward Robinson at his home in Olathe for sexual battery and theft.
Simultaneously, they execute search warrants on his primary residence, his farm in Lynn County, and those commercial storage units in Missouri.
And when they cut the locks on those storage units and search the grounds of that farm, they find the chemical drums. 5 bodies in total: Suzette Troughton, Isabel Lueca, Beverly Bonner, Sheila Faith, and 15-year-old Debbie Faith.
They confiscate the multi-computer array, the typewriters, the 115-item slave contracts.
They find the pre-addressed envelopes he had prepared for the victims' families. The entire decades-long illusion shatters in a single afternoon.
If we break down this collapse clinically, Robinson's methodology suffered from 3 distinct, fatal structural failures. The first is the technology assumption failure.
Right, he built his entire online hunting ground on the assumption that cyberspace was, and always would be, fundamentally untraceable.
Exactly, and we need to explain how that tracking evolved. When he first logged into BBS systems and chat rooms in 1993, the internet was essentially a series of burner phones.
Law enforcement had almost zero visibility, and internet service providers didn't keep rigorous logs of user activity.
But he failed to update his risk assessment as the environment matured. By the year 2000, the technological gap had closed. Law enforcement had developed specialized cybercrime units.
They could now subpoena internet service providers like AOL or Earthlink. They could request IP address logs. They could read the metadata in email headers.
They could trace an email sent by Slavemaster directly to the physical copper phone line terminating at his rural Kansas farm.
He genuinely believed he was operating in a dense fog of anonymity, but he was actually leaving a perfectly preserved, time-stamped audit trail of his every move.
He was running a 1970s paper fraud playbook in a 2000s digital world.
He thought he was the architect of the system, but he was just handing the server logs directly to the police.
And that technological arrogance leads directly to the second structural flaw, the retained evidence failure. This circles back to your earlier question about why he kept the bodies.
His underlying pathology demanded absolute continuous control.
He needed to possess the assets long after they ceased to be functional. He kept the signed slave contracts as tangible proof of his dominance. He kept the pre-addressed envelopes as monuments to his own cleverness.
He kept the victim's identification to fund his life, and he kept the bodies in rented units.
The moment a predator retains physical evidence of a crime, they transition the timeline from if they get caught to when they get caught.
A truly disciplined methodology, one devoid of ego and narcissism, would demand the absolute destruction of the remains, burning the contracts, and immediately severing all financial ties. But his ego required trophies.
His psychological need to control and retain fundamentally overpowered his operational need to evade detection.
And the third and final failure was the surviving victim failure. After decades of success, he became complacent.
He treated the 2 women from Texas with the exact same disregard he showed his isolated targets, failing to realize that his entire operational framework relied exclusively on the absolute guaranteed silence of the victim.
When Vicky and Jana went to the police, the silence broke, and the warrants were signed.
It's a fascinating look at how a system inevitably defeats itself through its own rigid assumptions.
If you look at how a predator's need for physical trophies destroys their evasion strategy, it's fascinating to consider what a truly disciplined methodology would look like. You know, the themes discussed are fictionally explored in the novel titled Adam, a psychological thriller about a killer who studied real historical failures and corrected them, available on Amazon Kindle.
But looking back at the real-world collapse of Robinson's system, once the physical evidence was secured, we enter the final phase of this operational audit, the digital autopsy and the psychological climax in the courtroom.
The ensuing trial was a landmark moment for digital forensics in the United States. We have to remember that in the early 2000s, the legal system was still actively figuring out how to handle internet data as evidence.
During the trial in Kansas, the state Supreme Court actually had to issue rulings validating that printed emails functioned as legally sound reproductions of electronically stored information.
The prosecutors essentially rebuilt his entire digital domain right there in the courtroom. They brought in the chat logs, the IP address assignments from the internet service providers, and the raw email headers.
They definitively proved, mathematically and chronologically, that the man sitting at the defense table was Slavemaster.
They showed exactly how and when he was logging in to send those posthumous emails to Suzette Troughton's mother, cross-referencing the timestamps with his physical location.
And the physical forensics perfectly mirrored the digital reconstruction. Investigators literally had to tape together thousands of shredded documents found in his farm's trash to locate the specific Missouri storage units.
They meticulously overlaid his vast digital footprint onto the physical geography of the Midwest.
But what the trial truly exposed, beyond the technology, was his ultimate psychological profile: weaponized compartmentalization driven by malignant narcissism.
The man maintained a 40-year marriage, attended church regularly, and led Boy Scout troops, all while actively managing a murder-for-profit enterprise out of chemical drums and internet chat rooms.
It proves the central thesis of our audit today. The murders were not a separate, chaotic psychological break. They were the absolute apex of a long-running, highly structured con system.
He started by conning his employers, then he conned the state through charities, and finally he conned vulnerable women out of their very lives.
Even when completely cornered by insurmountable forensic evidence, his need for information control remained absolute.
In Missouri, in order to avoid the death penalty in that jurisdiction, he entered a plea agreement where he formally acknowledged that prosecutors possessed enough evidence to convict him of the murders of Catherine Clampett and others.
But he flatly, categorically refused to disclose the locations of their missing bodies.
He withheld the final pieces of the puzzle just to maintain that last microscopic ounce of leverage over the families and the state. He is currently sitting on death row in Kansas, but he is still holding on to those secrets.
It's just about control until the very end.
Which leads me to a final philosophical question for you regarding his timeline. If the consumer internet hadn't exploded in the mid-90s to act as this massive accelerator for his crimes, do we think he would have eventually been caught through his localized paper trails? Or did cyberspace give him the exact tools he needed to evade capture for an extra decade?
It's a profound operational paradox. The technology both enabled his absolute peak of efficiency and guaranteed his eventual downfall.
Because without the internet, he wouldn't have been able to reach across the country to find Isabella Lewicka in another state or Suzette Troughton in Michigan.
Exactly. He would have been restricted to local classified ads and physical networking, which carries a significantly higher risk of local police connecting the missing person's dots.
Cyberspace gave him a global hunting ground and the illusion of total anonymity.
It undeniably bought him time, but it also autonomously recorded every single keystroke. The paper trails of the 1970s could be burned in a fireplace. The digital trails of the year 2000 lived indefinitely on corporate servers he did not control.
So the very tool that made him so prolific was the exact same tool that provided the time-stamped, undeniable mathematical proof of his guilt.
That is the core takeaway.
That brings us to the end of our structural audit for today. John Edward Robinson, the Slavemaster, teaches us that a predator's methodology is only ever as strong as its weakest assumption.
He assumed the internet was invisible, and he assumed his psychological control over his victims would last forever.
But the fundamental need to retain evidence, to keep the bodies, the contracts, the money, ultimately overpowered his ability to evade the physical consequences.
It is a stark clinical reminder that physical retention in an increasingly digital world is an inherently flawed evasion strategy.
Once again, if you want to see these concepts taken to their terrifying logical extreme in fiction, the themes discussed are fictionally explored in the novel titled Adam, a Psychological Thriller, about a killer who studied real historical failures and corrected them, available on Amazon Kindle.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a thought to mull over.
We've spent this time mapping out how Robinson exploited the early internet's anonymity in the late 90s. He hid in the novelty of chat rooms and email, utilizing a system that barely understood how to track him.
But think about your own life today.
Our digital footprints are 1,000 times larger, yet we willingly broadcast our physical locations, our purchasing habits, our desires, and our daily routines online every single second of the day.
If Robinson's entire methodology relied on finding the logistical gaps in an analog world transitioning to digital, what kind of predator is currently thriving in the massive, data-rich blind spots of today's hyper-connected, always-on reality?
It is a chilling operational question to leave on. The environment has evolved exponentially, which means the methodologies of those who exploit it have inevitably adapted as well.
The structural vulnerabilities are still out there, just waiting to be mapped.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into control studies. We'll see you next time.